that if you could get to that and you could create some certainty, and you could create some certainty around why it might be worth actually deploying a site if it was $60,000, because that $60,000 was really well spent in comparison with what you'd spend to try and get similar coverage on the macro, then you're starting to get to something that creates certainty, then you get into something that creates scale, and hopefully you get into something that people can then rely on and figure out that it makes sense to go build in this particular city, it makes sense to go build down that particular strait. So what does this really need? I've talked about a few things here. I think from the municipality, it needs the municipality to do a number of things. One of them is that there are a lot of assets in the municipality that are what I call positive assets and negative assets. The positive assets would be things like any of the fiber that's there, any of the power connections that are there, any of the street lamps or traffic lights or whatever. So there's a whole series of positive assets. There's a series of what I would term as negative assets in this sense. Things like gas lines and so on that can create obstacles, tram lines and so on that creates obstacles and increases the cost. And I think that one of the things we're seeing now is that with the mapping technology that's starting to come into in at this point, having really good GIS or geodata of the city makes a big difference to your starting point. I think the municipalities can do things in terms of looking at some of their ordinances, looking at how they maybe attract some of the people in to try and build. I think the utility companies can play a part here as well, because clearly they've got a lot of assets out there. They've got a lot of assets that could potentially be in play in terms of sites. And again, I think at the moment they're very, very focused on their own business, quite rightly so. But if we can find a way to work with them on a big scale, I think there's a lot of value there. In terms of carriers, when it comes to the carrier build-out, one of the things that was raised to us from a couple of cities was the idea that they weren't too keen on the idea of maybe getting the streets dug up 4 times or 5 times or whatever. And they'd really like it if there was some way that they wouldn't have to go through any disruption multiple times. So I think there's another piece in there is to figure out how can we create something that doesn't disrupt the city numerous times for the same end outcome. I think on the construction side, people need to look at maybe different ways to actually construct. Maybe we need to think about innovating on how we construct, how we can bring optical to a site, or how we can bring power to a site, but do it under a lot less cost. What I do think is that one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to build a model that allows us to understand where are the things that we as an industry ought to go innovate and ought to be able to do things that change that overall, go back to that histogram, that distribution on the histogram and move as many sites to the left. Because the more sites we move to the left, what happens is we create more certainty for the carriers in terms of when they go to a city they can build out and they know from a budgeting perspective, this is the range that they're in. But if we stay between a Kia Sedona and a Bentley, not the convertible, but a Bentley, then that range is just, I worry that range is just too big. There's too much uncertainty about what you're going to face when you get out there. So, I'm going to hit the last slide. Yes. I'll leave you with that. But just in summary, I think from our perspective, we see this as a big data issue. We think it's extremely hard to get some of the data. We don't underestimate how difficult it is to create some of these data sets and to create the analysis. I don't think anybody on our side would underestimate that. And I know I spoke to some people this morning and yesterday, and people people, everybody has their horror story about the things that go wrong or the things that are impeding them. So I don't think it's a case of underestimating it, but I think it's a case that if we don't do something, if we don't try and get to grips with some of these problems and take them forward now, what I'm seeing is that when we go forward, what's going to happen, take what the FCC did last week, I think it was last week. They looked at putting some rules around 3.5 gig spectrum. When you look at that 3.5 is not a spectrum that you'll build a macro layer in. It's a spectrum that you'll build a small cell layer in. It's a spectrum you're going to build indoor. If you look at what people are talking about for 5G, the spectrum there is, whether it comes about, it's millimeter wave, centimeter wave. Again, the propagation properties of that say it's not going to be a macro spectrum, it's going to be a spectrum you have to build densely around. So these things are coming. And my thought for you is, let's not wait until they come and then find out the technology is all maturing and we can't do anything about making it happen on the ground. We need to start thinking about these things now and start tackling the problems now. Because as I said, don't underestimate how fast some of these things are going to happen and how fast things will change. So, how am I doing for time? They haven't given me the sign, I've got to get off the stage yet. So,